Welcome back to the channel. Imagine a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Chicago in the late 1970s. Ordinary houses, ordinary streets, neighbors who recognize one another. And one house that, from the outside, looks no different from any other. Inside lives John Wayne Gacy, a contractor who has built a respectable public identity. He runs a business, knows people in local politics, participates in community life, and sometimes appears in a clown costume under the name Pogo. Nothing about that public image prepares anyone for what investigators will eventually discover beneath his home. For years, the property remains part of an ordinary neighborhood. People pass it every day. Workers enter and leave. Visitors come and go. Gacy speaks with neighbors and continues his business. But hidden on that property is evidence of a murder series that will eventually result in 33 murder convictions. The case will begin with a single disappearance. It will end with police uncovering one of the most notorious crime scenes in American history. And the most important question will not simply be who John Wayne Gacy was. It will be how he managed to convince so many people that there was nothing unusual about him. If you are new to the channel, subscribe now. We cover real criminal cases focusing on the investigation, the evidence, and the details that finally reveal what happened. And if you are already subscribed, thank you for being here. Now let's go back to the beginning. The investigators also had to resist a natural temptation to let the scale of the discovery overwhelm the process of proving individual crimes. A large crime scene can create a powerful impression, but a courtroom still requires specific evidence. Detectives, therefore, had to document discoveries carefully and preserve the connection between physical findings and individual missing person cases. That work was essential because every conviction had to stand on its own. The investigation became a long exercise in sorting, comparing, and confirming information, rather than simply counting discoveries. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago on March 17, 1942. His childhood was difficult. His father struggled with alcoholism and was reportedly abusive. But nothing in the public record suggests that people around the young Gacy could simply look at him and see the criminal he would eventually become. As a young man, Gacy moved to Iowa. He married and developed a career in the restaurant business. He eventually became involved in managing Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants owned by his father-in-law. For a time, his life appeared conventional. Then, in 1968, Gacy was convicted in Iowa of a sexual offense and received a 10-year prison sentence. He did not serve the entire sentence. After his release, he returned to Chicago. That return is one of the most important turning points in the story. Gacy did not retreat from society. He rebuilt his life publicly. He established himself in the construction business. He founded PDM Contractors and became known as a hard-working businessman. The new identity was useful. It gave him legitimate reasons to meet people. It gave him employees. It gave him contacts. It gave him a public reputation that was increasingly difficult to reconcile with his criminal past. And Gacy worked hard to strengthen that reputation. He became active in politics and community events. He knew local officials and appeared in photographs connected with political activities. He was no longer simply trying to avoid attention. He was creating a version of himself that attracted the right kind of attention. The timing of the investigation is also important. Gacy was arrested in 1979, and his convictions followed in 1980. The FBI's historical record places its investigative assistance within that period. The case, therefore, belongs to an era when law enforcement was developing new ways of thinking about serial offenders. Investigators were learning that a repeated pattern could be more informative than any single incident. That shift in thinking would become increasingly important in later decades. One of the strangest parts of Gacy's public identity was his clown persona. He sometimes dressed as a clown and performed at community events. The character was known as Pogo. The image was almost the opposite of what investigators would eventually discover. A clown was supposed to entertain people, make them laugh, and create a sense of safety. Gacy understood the value of appearing approachable. The clown persona became part of his public life, but it was only one part of a much larger image. To different people, Gacy could be different things. To customers, he was a contractor. To employees, he was a boss. To political contacts, he was a community participant. To neighbors, he was a familiar man living nearby. That ability to occupy several ordinary roles mattered enormously. The danger was not hidden because Gacy was invisible. The danger was hidden because he was visible in ways that appeared harmless. And that distinction would become central to the investigation. Years later, the phrase "killer clown" would become permanently associated with his name. But the costume itself was not the important part. The important part was the trust surrounding the man wearing it. People often assume that a dangerous person should look dangerous. Gacy's case demonstrated how unreliable that assumption can be. The man who would eventually be convicted of 33 murders had spent years constructing an ordinary public identity. And that identity would help him remain outside the focus of suspicion until the final stage of his crimes. There was another practical difficulty. Investigators had to identify people whose disappearances might not initially have appeared connected to Gacy. Some records were old. Some families had been waiting for answers. Some evidence required laboratory examination or comparison with information collected elsewhere. The investigation therefore moved in two directions at once: inward, toward the physical evidence on Gacy's property, and outward, toward the wider record of missing people in the region. Gacy lived in a ranch-style home in the Chicago area. From the street, there was nothing extraordinary about it. It was simply another house in a residential neighborhood. But the property contained a crawl space beneath the building. That space would eventually become the center of a massive investigation. According to the Illinois Supreme Court, 29 bodies were discovered on Gacy's property, including remains found beneath the house and in other parts of the property. 4 additional bodies were recovered from the Des Plaines and Illinois rivers. The numbers are difficult to comprehend. But the investigators did not know any of this when they first began looking at Gacy. They were not initially conducting a search for 33 murders. They were investigating a missing person. That distinction matters. Large criminal cases often begin with a small piece of information that does not yet reveal the scale of the problem. A person disappears. A family asks questions. A police report is filed. A witness remembers a conversation. A vehicle is noticed. A name appears in an investigation. The challenge for detectives is recognizing when those separate details belong to the same story. In Gacy's case, the connection would begin with the disappearance of Robert Piest, and that disappearance would eventually lead investigators into the house itself. The public reaction also created pressure. Once the scale of the discovery became known, Gacy's name became nationally recognizable. But publicity could not replace police work. Detectives still had to verify identities, document evidence, interview witnesses, and prepare material that could withstand courtroom challenges. The difference between a sensational headline and a successful prosecution is evidence. In Gacy's case, investigators had to build that evidence step by step. On December 11, 1978, Robert Piest disappeared in Des Plaines, Illinois. Piest was working at Nissen Pharmacy. That evening, his mother arrived to pick him up. Instead of leaving with her, Peast said that he wanted to speak with a contractor about a possible job. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Peast left the pharmacy. He never returned. For investigators, this was an unusually important lead. They had a missing person. They had a specific appointment. They had a named contractor. And they learned that Gacy had been at the pharmacy around the time Peast disappeared. The investigation quickly turned toward him. Detectives began examining Gacy's movements and explanations. They looked at his business. They looked at his past. They looked at the people who worked for him. And they began asking a much more uncomfortable question. Was Gacy simply the last person connected to a missing man, or was he directly responsible? The investigation had reached a point where ordinary explanations were no longer enough. Police needed evidence. They needed to know what had happened to Peast. And that meant taking a closer look at Gacy's property. The closer they looked, the more unusual details they noticed. The house had a persistent odor. There were circumstances surrounding the property that Gacy had previously explained in ordinary terms. But investigators now had a reason to question those explanations. They obtained a search warrant. And the search changed the case forever. The case also shows why a suspect's social reputation can become a dangerous distraction. Investigators cannot assume that a respected person is innocent, but they also cannot assume that a disliked person is guilty. The correct approach is to examine the facts without allowing reputation to decide the conclusion. Gacy's public image made him difficult to imagine as a killer, but the evidence eventually made his image irrelevant. Police entered Gacy's home looking for evidence connected to Robert Peast. The search was focused. Investigators were trying to find information that could explain a disappearance. But the property quickly became more important than anyone had expected. They examined objects. They examined rooms. They examined the property itself. And eventually, attention turned toward the crawl space. That was where investigators found the first human remains. The discovery immediately transformed the investigation. This was no longer a missing person case involving one man. The police were looking at a potential series of murders. Then additional remains were discovered. The number increased. The investigation expanded. Every discovery created another question. Who was the person? When had they disappeared? How had they become connected to Gacy? What evidence could identify them? And how long had the crimes been taking place? The property became a crime scene on a scale that investigators had never expected when they first began following the trail of Robert Peast. The Illinois Supreme Court later recorded that 29 bodies were recovered from Gacy's property. 4 more were found in rivers. The investigation therefore had to extend beyond the house. Detectives were not only excavating a property, they were reconstructing years of disappearances. They had to compare missing person reports, witness statements, physical evidence, and information from Gacy himself. The house had provided the breakthrough. Now the investigators had to turn that breakthrough into a complete case. The physical setting mattered as well. Gacy's property gave investigators a concentrated location in which to work. Once the search began, discoveries could be documented in relation to the house and surrounding areas. That made the property itself an important source of information. The location was not merely where evidence was found. It became part of the reconstruction of how the crimes had been concealed. The most difficult part of the investigation was not simply discovering the remains. It was identifying the people. Each discovery represented a separate case. A missing person report somewhere. A family waiting for news. A disappearance that might have been investigated by different officers at a different time. Investigators had to build connections between old reports and new evidence. This was long before the modern digital systems that allow police agencies to compare information almost instantly. The investigation required records, interviews, laboratory work, and careful comparison. Gacy's construction business also became important. His employees and associates provided information about his activities and the property. Investigators looked at the people who had worked for him. They examined the movements of those who had been around the house. They searched for anything that could connect missing people to Gacy. The process was slow, but the evidence was accumulating. And Gacy was no longer simply a respected contractor. He was the central suspect in a growing murder investigation. His earlier conviction also became relevant. The fact that he had already served time for a sexual offense gave investigators important context when evaluating the new evidence. But context was not enough. Prosecutors would eventually need to prove individual murders beyond a reasonable doubt. That meant the investigation could not stop at the discovery of the bodies. Every piece of evidence had to be examined. Every identity had to be established as carefully as possible. Every connection had to survive scrutiny in court. And Gacy's defense would eventually attack exactly that question: whether the evidence proved the crimes and whether Gacy understood what he was doing. The legal process also forced the prosecution to separate fact from speculation. Public discussion of a notorious case can quickly become filled with theories about motives, personalities, or unknown victims. A courtroom has a different standard. Prosecutors must establish what can be proven. The Gacy prosecution, therefore, focused on the murders supported by admissible evidence, resulting in 33 convictions. The final number associated with Gacy's convictions was 33. The Illinois Supreme Court confirmed 33 murder convictions. 12 of those convictions resulted in death sentences. The remaining murder convictions resulted in natural life sentences. 33 is a simple number to say, but it represents 33 separate homicide cases, 33 investigations, 33 sets of evidence, and 33 victims whose disappearances had to be explained. The investigation, therefore, became much more than a search for a single killer. It became an attempt to reconstruct an entire period of criminal activity. Gacy had been living a public life while the crimes were taking place. He was working. He was maintaining relationships. He was involved in community activities. He was dealing with customers. He was operating his business. The contrast was one of the most unsettling elements of the case. A person could see Gacy during the day and have no reason to imagine what investigators would later discover. That is why the case became such an important example for criminal investigators and researchers. The question was not simply how to identify a violent offender. It was how to recognize one when the person did not fit the public image people expected. Gacy's success depended heavily on the distance between his public identity and his hidden behavior. But once police discovered the bodies, that distance disappeared. The evidence was physical. It was on his property, and it could no longer be explained by reputation. The FBI's later historical account is especially useful because it places Gacy within the development of behavioral analysis. Agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler conducted systematic interviews with serial offenders, including Gacy, as part of efforts to understand violent criminal behavior. The purpose was to identify patterns that could assist future investigations. This was part of a broader shift toward treating behavior itself as investigative information. As the investigation developed, Gacy made statements about the killings. According to the Illinois Supreme Court, on the night before his arrest, he told his attorneys that he was responsible for 33 murders. That statement was significant, but investigators still had to verify the details. A confession is not a substitute for evidence. Investigators had to determine whether Gacy's statements matched what had actually been discovered. They compared his information with the remains, the property, missing person reports, and other evidence. Some of his statements were also complicated by his attempts to explain his behavior through claims about his mental state. That would become important during the trial. Gacy's defense argued that he was legally insane. The prosecution disagreed. The question was not whether Gacy had psychological problems. The legal question was whether those problems prevented him from understanding the nature and wrongfulness of his actions. The evidence would be presented to a jury. Experts would testify. The defense would challenge the prosecution's interpretation of Gacy's behavior, and the prosecution would point back to the organization of the crimes, the concealment of the bodies, and the evidence recovered from his property. The trial would ultimately decide whether the jury believed the insanity defense. But before that happened, investigators had to finish building the case. Another important point is that the final number of convictions should not be confused with every theory ever proposed about Gacy. The documented legal case concerns 33 murders. A responsible account should distinguish proven convictions from speculation about other possible crimes. The strongest part of the story is already extraordinary. Investigators established 33 murder convictions and recovered 29 bodies from Gacy's property, with 4 additional bodies recovered from rivers. The investigation also attracted the attention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI provided investigative assistance to Illinois law enforcement. The Bureau's records on Gacy remain part of the FBI vault. The FBI describes Gacy as having been arrested in 1979 and later convicted in 1980 of 33 murders. His case also became relevant to the development of behavioral analysis. The FBI's historical materials explain that its behavioral science unit began studying patterns in violent offenders and conducting systematic interviews with serial killers, including Gacy. This work was not about turning a criminal into a celebrity. It was about understanding patterns, how offenders behaved, how they selected victims, how they interacted with investigators, how they attempted to control the narrative around their crimes. The goal was practical. If investigators could recognize behavioral patterns, they might be able to connect crimes that otherwise appeared unrelated. That problem had been particularly important in serial murder investigations. A person can disappear in one jurisdiction while another disappearance occurs somewhere else. Without communication and comparison, investigators may not realize that the same offender is responsible. The Gacy case demonstrated how valuable cooperation could be. Local investigators had the crime scene. Other agencies had information. Federal investigators could contribute additional resources and expertise. The investigation therefore became more than a local police operation. It became part of the broader study of serial crime in the United States. And the lessons learned from cases like Gacy's would influence criminal investigative analysis for decades. In the end, the investigation succeeded because several independent forms of evidence reinforced one another. The disappearance of Robert Piest created the initial focus. The search produced physical evidence. The physical evidence connected the property to missing people. Statements from Gacy provided additional information. Witnesses and records helped establish the broader pattern. The prosecution then presented those elements to a jury. The case was not solved by one clue alone. Gacy's trial began in 1980. The prosecution presented its case around the evidence gathered during the investigation. The remains were central. So were the circumstances connecting individual victims to Gacy. The defense focused heavily on mental illness. Gacy's attorneys argued that he was legally insane. Psychiatric experts presented different interpretations of his mental state. The jury had to decide which interpretation was supported by the evidence. But there was another problem for the defense. The prosecution could point to the organized nature of the crimes and the efforts made to conceal evidence. The bodies had not simply appeared beneath the house. They had been hidden. Evidence had been moved. The property had been used as a place of concealment. The prosecution argued that these actions demonstrated awareness of wrongdoing. The jury ultimately rejected the insanity defense. Gacy was convicted of 33 murders. 12 death sentences were imposed. The remaining murder convictions carried natural life sentences. The verdict closed one stage of the case. But Gacy's legal strategy did not end. The death sentence meant that his attorneys would continue challenging the conviction and punishment through appeals. The case would move through Illinois courts and later through the federal system. For Gacy, the courtroom battle was not over. For investigators, however, the central question had been answered. The man they had been investigating was now formally convicted of 33 murders. The investigators also had to resist a natural temptation to let the scale of the discovery overwhelm the process of proving individual crimes. A large crime scene can create a powerful impression, but a courtroom still requires specific evidence. Detectives, therefore, had to document discoveries carefully and preserve the connection between physical findings and individual missing person cases. That work was essential because every conviction had to stand on its own. The investigation became a long exercise in sorting, comparing, and confirming information, rather than simply counting discoveries. The years after the trial were filled with legal challenges. Gacy's attorneys argued that various aspects of the investigation and trial had been improper. They challenged the handling of evidence. They challenged questions concerning psychiatric testimony. They challenged the effectiveness of legal representation. The Illinois Supreme Court reviewed the case. In 1984, the court considered Gacy's appeal and upheld the convictions and sentences. In 1988, the Illinois Supreme Court again reviewed his post-conviction claims and rejected them. The case then continued through federal litigation. The process was lengthy because a death sentence receives extensive judicial review. Every major legal claim had to be considered. Every stage created another opportunity for the defense to seek relief. But the courts repeatedly left the core convictions intact. The evidence discovered at Gacy's home remained central. The number of victims remained 33. The death sentences remained in place for 12 murder convictions. Eventually, there were no remaining legal arguments capable of preventing the execution. The investigation that had begun with a missing person had now reached its final legal stage. Gacy had spent years attempting to avoid the ultimate punishment, but the courts had repeatedly rejected his challenges. By the early 1990s, the end was approaching, and the man who had once controlled the image presented to his neighbors could no longer control the outcome of his case. The timing of the investigation is also important. Gacy was arrested in 1979, and his convictions followed in 1980. The FBI's historical record places its investigative assistance within that period. The case, therefore, belongs to an era when law enforcement was developing new ways of thinking about serial offenders. Investigators were learning that a repeated pattern could be more informative than any single incident. That shift in thinking would become increasingly important in later decades. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at the Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. He was 52 years old. The execution marked the legal end of his case, but it did not end the questions surrounding the investigation. How had the crimes continued for years? Why had earlier warnings not stopped him? How had his public reputation remained intact? Why did the investigation finally break open when it did? The answer to the last question is particularly important. It was not one dramatic clue that solved the case. It was a chain. Robert Peace disappeared. Investigators discovered his connection to Gacy. Police began examining Gacy more closely. They obtained a search warrant. They searched his home. They found remains. Those remains led to additional questions. Additional evidence led to additional identities. And eventually, the investigation established a series of 33 murders. That is how the case collapsed. Not because Gacy suddenly abandoned his public image, but because investigators finally had enough evidence to see through it. The house that had helped conceal the crimes became the center of the prosecution. The reputation that had protected Gacy could not protect him from physical evidence. And the name John Wayne Gacy became permanently associated with the case. There was another practical difficulty. Investigators had to identify people whose disappearances might not initially have appeared connected to Gacy. Some records were old. Some families had been waiting for answers. Some evidence required laboratory examination or comparison with information collected elsewhere. The investigation therefore moved in two directions at once: inward toward the physical evidence on Gacy's property, and outward toward the wider record of missing people in the region. There is a powerful irony at the center of this story. Gacy's home helped him hide the evidence, but it also gave investigators the evidence they needed. The crawl space was private. The property was under his control. That made it useful for concealment. But once police received a warrant and searched the house, the same privacy worked against him. The evidence was concentrated in one location. Investigators could document it, excavate it, analyze it, and compare it with missing person records. The property became a map of the investigation. Every discovery created a new lead. Every lead created another search. And the larger the investigation became, the harder it was for Gacy to maintain his original story. A single missing person had brought police to his door. The house then revealed the scale of what had been hidden. This is why the Gacy case remains so important to students of criminal investigation. It demonstrates that concealment is never the same as disappearance. Evidence can remain hidden for years, but hidden evidence is still evidence. And once investigators find the right place, years of unanswered questions can suddenly begin to make sense. The house had not been silent. It had simply not been understood. The final breakthrough came when investigators stopped accepting ordinary explanations for unusual circumstances and began testing them against the evidence. The public reaction also created pressure. Once the scale of the discovery became known, Gacy's name became nationally recognizable. But publicity could not replace police work. Detectives still had to verify identities, document evidence, interview witnesses, and prepare material that could withstand courtroom challenges. The difference between a sensational headline and a successful prosecution is evidence. In Gacy's case, investigators had to build that evidence step by step. Gacy's public identity remains one of the most studied parts of the case. He was not a complete recluse. He was not a mysterious stranger who appeared only at night. He had a business. He had employees. He participated in politics. He attended community activities. He knew people. He talked to neighbors. He could be sociable. He could be persuasive. And he sometimes appeared as Pogo the Clown. The public image mattered because it influenced how people interpreted warning signs. If a suspicious detail came from a person already considered dangerous, people might react immediately. But when the same detail came from someone viewed as respectable, it could be dismissed. That is a basic human tendency. We use previous impressions to interpret new information. Gacy benefited from that tendency. His reputation created a presumption of normality. But investigators eventually stopped asking whether Gacy seemed like the kind of person who could commit murder. They started asking a much better question. What does the evidence say? That change in perspective was decisive. Evidence does not care about social status. It does not care whether a suspect is popular. It does not care whether someone is a businessman, a political activist, or a clown. It asks a different question. Can the facts be connected? In Gacy's case, they could, and once enough facts were connected, the public image became irrelevant. The case also shows why a suspect's social reputation can become a dangerous distraction. Investigators cannot assume that a respected person is innocent, but they also cannot assume that a disliked person is guilty. The correct approach is to examine the facts without allowing reputation to decide the conclusion. Gacy's public image made him difficult to imagine as a killer, but the evidence eventually made his image irrelevant. The Gacy case also illustrates a broader problem with serial investigations. A serial offender does not necessarily commit crimes in a way that makes the pattern immediately obvious. Different victims may disappear in different places. Different investigators may handle the cases. Different witnesses may remember different details. And the evidence from one case may remain isolated from another. Modern law enforcement has more sophisticated databases and communication systems than investigators had during the 1970s. The FBI's later development of behavioral analysis and the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime reflected a growing effort to help investigators recognize patterns in violent crime. The FBI's own history describes how the Behavioral Science Unit studied serial offenders and how criminal investigative analysis developed into a specialized investigative tool. Gacy's case became part of that history. The goal was not simply to understand one offender. It was to improve the ability of investigators to recognize future offenders. A missing person should not always be viewed as an isolated event. A suspicious vehicle may matter. A repeated name may matter. A witness statement that seems insignificant may become important later. The central lesson is simple. Investigations improve when information is connected. The Gacy case showed what can happen when the pieces finally come together. One disappearance became a suspect. The suspect became a search. The search became a crime scene. The crime scene became a series of identities. And those identities became 33 murder convictions. The physical setting mattered as well. Gacy's property gave investigators a concentrated location in which to work. Once the search began, discoveries could be documented in relation to the house and surrounding areas. That made the property itself an important source of information. The location was not merely where evidence was found. It became part of the reconstruction of how the crimes had been concealed. It is easy for a true crime story to become focused entirely on the offender. That can be misleading. The case was never really about a celebrity criminal. It was about people who disappeared.